And the first thing, that's why when they wanted to do disengagement, they said the mechanized forces must pull back because it was hurting them maximum. And change our focus, I'm glad that is taking place, from the erstwhile CI-oriented Western Front to a primary threat which lies on the Northern Front. Indian military history is replete with lessons and examples of successful application of light tanks, particularly in the mountains. You start with the first battle that took place after independence, the Battle of Zojila. The Stuart light tank saved Ladakh. So if you can't detect a threat today and the threat manifests itself, then you're reacting to the threat.
Correct.
If you detect a threat, then before it manifests, you are able to neutralize. Why have they even spoken that? Because saying that the tanks, of which it is saying, makes big news. Saying the drones are not effective makes small news. But with all the M.Tech young students, is involved with the private industry, and we came back and we made certain parts and assemblies and technology which is superior to what even the Russians did. Make in India doesn't happen with a whip. It will be make for India, made in India, and make in India. It has its transition.
Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. Today I have a very, very important subject that has been much in debate, especially after the Armenia-Azerbaijan war. Mechanized forces. Let me expand. Indian mechanized forces and their future perspectives. To discuss that, I have with me a former Director General of the Mechanized Forces of the Indian Army, Lt Gen AB Shivane, PVSM, AVSM, VSM. The Lieutenant General is an alumnus of the National Defence Academy, Pune, a scholar, a warrior with over 39 years of outstanding service in the Indian Army. He has represented India in the United Nations Peacekeeping Force in Guatemala. He was nominated for the honorary Aide de Camp to the President of India in 2017. The General today is a renowned speaker of defense, geopolitics, armament, and Make in India initiatives. He's an acclaimed defense analyst with several publications to his credit. Thank you so much for joining me to have this conversation, sir.
Thank you, Adi, Jai Hind, and thank you very much for your very kind invite. It's a pleasure to be here on this platform and share my views on a subject which has been very close to my heart, with over 4 decades of experience in uniform and thereafter out of uniform also, when I was the consultant with the Ordnance Factory Board for Combat Vehicles. So thank you very much for the invite. Always a pleasure to be with you on this platform.
I'd like to take a moment and tell all the viewers what you've been doing for the past 3 months, sir. General has been actively involved in helping COVID patients in and around our national capital with an organization called the Kranti. So why don't you spend a minute or two in telling us what all you've done before we get into the mechanized forces?
Yeah, it's, I would just say it's humans for humanity, and you have to adapt and lay down your priorities as the circumstances changes. And it's nearly 3 to 4 months back when the second wave came in, and I decided that I need to put a stop to my strategic writings and webinars and interviews and all, and focus my effort along with an organization like you mentioned, Kranti, to reach out to those who are impacted by this in a very, very structured and well-meaning way, which I evolved along with the organization, to get them admissions, oxygen, medicines, plasma, and more importantly, make them feel that they are people. You may not know anyone, you may not know him, but you are there for them. And I'm telling you, it gives you so much of pleasure when you're able to help people. It's not the national or international certificates I got which gave me the pride for what I did, but those simple messages and bonding that I've developed for people whom I was able to help out. I think that's a blessing. So I take this opportunity of being as a COVID helpline frontline worker as a blessing of God to have given to me.
Thank you, sir, for what you did and your colleagues as well. I'm sure it's gone a long way for a lot of people during times of distress. Sir, coming to our topic today, last year when you saw the Chinese intruding into Ladakh, and one of the biggest things that came out that there were tanks facing off with tanks at very, very short ranges. I'd like to ask you, sir, what went through your mind when you saw something like that in terms of what is the situation like, as well as our capacity to deal with that situation on our front, sir?
Okay, Adi, let me start by saying that tanks in the Indo-China context is not a new phenomenon. But certainly, we have come a long way since the successful application of just a handful of AMX-13 tanks at Chishul and in the 1962 war, and also at Nathula, which put the Chinese to a halt. But over a period of time, both sides have realized that the utility of mechanized platforms, not only for giving a conventional edge, but also for a strategic deterrence is important. And therefore, they've realized that this mobile protected platform is has a battle winning role, particularly both offensive and defensive, particularly along the numerous valleys, plateaus, and passes that exist. So the enhancement of mechanized forces started both in Sikkim and in Ladakh sector, both in quantity and the quality in terms of upgraded equipment, quite a few years back. But I would say it with a lot of pride that when I was the DG Mech Forces from 2015 to 2017, I was very convinced, and we all put our hands together and inducted a large number of mechanized forces into these areas as part of a well thought of futuristic capability building and threat assessment, both for defensive and offensive operations. That's why the result was when the Chinese misadventure took place in Ladakh in 2019. I was very confident because our mechanized forces were well acclimatized, they were tuned to the operating environment, the terrain, they were trained, they had carried out exercises in various operational roles. Their technologies were suited for those sort of high altitude areas. Their operating procedures were refined, and their tactics for that particular operational role was well rehearsed. So, therefore, when it took place, I was very, very certain that we are on a very sound footing. What we needed to do, and which we did so, but a little late, was to ensure that its application of mechanized forces takes place more in a preemptive and an offensive manner. Because whether it's tanks, ICVs, they are instrument of offensive application, not defensive, though they can deny certain passes and certain defiles. So when these our tanks and mechanized forces were applied in the Chishul sector south of Parangso Lake, it gave me a lot of pleasure because that's where the sensibility lies, and you saw what happened. Now, it not only dislocated the Chinese, which is a major function of mechanized forces, physically, psychologically, morally, technologically, and in time frame, temporally. So complete dislocation took place, and therefore it created a criticality. And the first thing, that's why when they wanted to do disengagement, they said the mechanized forces must pull back because it was hurting them maximum. But my assessment of situation of the Ladakh episode which happened has been well documented in my numerous articles I've written, including two of them which are published in the Military Literary Festival book on Ladakh. But the gist of my logic was A, that Chinese aim is strategic and must be understood and responded accordingly. Therefore, we need to revisit our strategic and operation outlook of the Chinese threat. While our tactical responses have stood the test of time and our soldiers on ground have done exceedingly well, yet we have to learn lessons why we were surprised, how could we have applied force levels better, and how could we have had a better manifestations. Be sure that the Chinese will continue to stymie and make efforts to stymie India's rise and undermine its regional and global aspirations unless the cost benefit factor is adverse to them. And that's a lesson that we need to learn. We also need to understand that Chinese only understand power.
Correct.
So our response must have a offensive political military intent, a demonstrated capability which is credible, and a desired capacity with inbuilt resilience intrinsic to all elements of combat power. I do not want to differentiate in the services or within the service anything. They are all part of a fighting force and they must be integrated and harmonized in all domains, including cyberspace. Because unless you hurt the dragon will not recoil. Therefore, we need to address our capacity building and change our focus. I'm glad that is taking place from the erstwhile CI-oriented Western Front to a primary threat which lies on the Northern Front. We must learn our lessons accordingly. As regards our mechanized forces, I'm very confident that even with the present capability that we have, we will be able to stymie the Chinese threat. Yet, there is plenty of scope for adding teeth to the capability and offensive content to their application. Therefore, we have to keep this in mind because when the Chinese have recoiled and I would say asked for a pullback, and it de facto is a stalemate to their strategic intent. And therefore, if a stalemate for an aggressor in a notion of victory is a setback to the Chinese, we must also understand and give due respect to the Chinese or the adversary's capabilities. We can't shun it down. It's important to understand that. And they have been executing maneuvers and heavy drop capabilities to showcase their application in capture of passes and lightly held areas. That's been taking place. So we cannot underestimate their capabilities and response. They have a large force level. They've got 2 divisions worth of mechanized stroke motorized and a regiment which is like a brigade of mech infantry, which is well integrated with attack helicopters, rockets, drones. But essentially, they've got 2 types of tanks. They've got the T-99 or 96, which is the equivalent of the 72 and the T-90Rs. So we are good, but we are much more trained and much more attuned to the application. But they also have the ZTQ. I would call it a light medium tank. It's not really a light tank because 35-ton category is not a light tank. It's a light medium tank, but then it has its own utility, which is a little edge that they have because we don't have that sort of a capability, and therefore we need to create this capability. As regards, let me just also highlight that, if this situation had gone into a limited or a escalated dynamics, I do feel our capabilities and capacities to retard in a defensive manner existed. Though our deterrence failed, and that's why the Chinese came in. Had our deterrence been in place, they wouldn't have dared to do that. But I think they underestimated the response as such. Therefore, we need to build our capabilities as such. Particularly, I would say, since you're talking about mechanized forces, I would say one, induct the light tank and the wheeled APCs expeditiously in the northern front, and hone strategic air mobility to the extent possible, including sidestepping and induction of rapid action forces, operationalize mountain integrated battle groups with mechanized forces as the spearheads, both for defensive and for offensive operations, upgrade the equipment, T-72, T-90s, BMPs for fleet management, expedite the next generation of tanks, create responsive in situ logistics capability, force sidestepping infrastructure, training facilities, both in Ladakh and Sikkim, and I am a strong proponent of viewing mechanized forces holistically. I mean, it's not tanks and ICVs alone. There is a SP element of AD, there's a SP element of artillery, and more importantly, the attack helicopter as an extension of a maneuver arm in the third dimension. But force packaging must be looked as one package. You call it whatever you don't call it mechanized forces, don't call it. You call it a IBG, you call it anything. But the capability, that summation of all this is much more than just the add-on. And that must be understood, that we have to go beyond, armor, mech, artillery, AD, attack helicopters. We have to look at creating intrinsic, cohesive, integrated combat capabilities where we optimize each other to the hilt.
Very interesting, sir. I must say, one of the biggest things that is being spoken about is integration today, and you brought it out in a very, very simple way. That is the need of the hour at the end of it, and at least for the offensive group or the defensive group fighting the battle at that time, whatever forces that needs to be done, and there must be some work done. So you spoke about the light tank. I'd like you to spend, because this has again been in a lot of debates, conversations with regards to defense in India. We've got some good tanks, the T-90, the Arjun and the T-72, although old, but it's been upgraded to a far large extent. I'd like you to spend some more time with regards to the advantages that a light tank would have in higher altitudes. And, what is it that we should look for in terms of this particular machine?
Yeah, Arif, let me confess to you that I have been very, very professionally focused and convinced of the need of light tank. And I drove it personally as a 1-point agenda when I was the DG Mechanized Forces as such. It's because I would not call it induction of light tanks. I'll call it reinduction or reintroduction of the light tanks. Indian military history is replete with lessons and examples of successful application of light tanks, particularly in the mountains. You start with the first battle that took place after independence, the Battle of Zojila. The Stuart light tanks saved Ladakh. Then 62, AMX-13, both at Trishul and Nathal. 71, you had PT-76, which crossed the Meghna and thereafter were instrumental in capitulation of Dhaka in 71, leading to the liberation of Bangladesh. So a professional soldier must understand this, that look, the terrain hasn't changed. The threat aspect has only multiplied. So a one-size-fit-all solution for such diverse terrain cannot be applied. While the mainstay will continue to be the medium tank, there are areas where the application of medium tank, just because of its size, mobility, turning radius, high angle shooting capability, is limited. Therefore, in those areas, you require to have a lighter version which is has strategic mobility, high firing rate capability, and that fear that we carried erstwhile of low protection or low survivability today has been offset by technology. So anyone who's keeping up with armored fighting vehicles technology would realize that you can't compare the erstwhile survivability of the light tank to today's. So efforts have been made over the last 3 decades, but I think they were stagnant mindset and status quo outlook that prevented its out. Uh, See, you must understand the operational effectiveness of a force is based on three factors: deployability, employability, and capability. Deployability is a factor that you can deploy it across all terrains in terms of strategic mobility by air, operational mobility by track or by tank transporters from one place to the other, and tactical mobility to go in that area. So, certain passes, certain areas, particularly in the northern region, in Ladakh and certain regions in the eastern sector also, limit the medium tank. So there we need to plug in. While your mainstay will medium tank, but you need to plug in and have a good, healthy mix of it. Employability is a function of its survivability and its lethality and its agility in the entire environment as a combined armed force. And therefore, you have to have these factors of deployability, employability. Now, let me say that how do you would look at what is the payoffs and this reintroduction of light tank will give us. See, reintroduction of light tanks, particularly in the high altitude mountain area, will permit its air deployability. It'll, and when I talk of light tanks, let me say we need to also look at wheeled APCs also. They're also important fact. They would permit air deployability. They would permit move on tracks or wheels across mountain passes where low classification bridges takes place. Or passes has a narrow lane in certain built-up areas. They would allow us for a high-angle shooting capability. They would give you the agility, versatility, and mobility factor along with lethality. And not only high altitude, you look at certain restricted terrains where marshy areas, riverine terrain in Punjab, run of Kutch, island territories, out of area contingencies, UN commitment. I think this aspect of employment of light tank becomes important because it will add teeth to our limited offensive or quid pro quo capabilities as such. And I would say that it's not a luxury today; it's a necessity, and we need to generate this capability.
Very well put, sir. I must say it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. And I think the Chinese standoff has taught us that we need something that is more mobile.
Yeah, see, you have to, if you look, all aspect, uh, you require something which is light, which can go over lighter bridges. You require something which has a shorter turning radius. You require something which can shoot high. You require something which has got a low ground pressure. All you require something which can be quickly, move from one theater to other theater, either on its own tracks or airlifted and dropped. So, world over, the concept has changed, and if you look at the future combat vehicles, even US and DARPA itself is doing a study on a light mobility combat vehicle. They're all talking of 18 to 20 ton worth with lethality because today time is a criticality. You have to bring a force at the right time, at the right place, and with the right impact. Because victory in war is going to be defined by the least number of casualties and the least time that you apply your force. And light tanks are going to facilitate that.
Absolutely, I think that's very well put. So I must say that's makes for a very sound uh, argument, logic, however one wants to take it. So another big question that is being spoken about today with regards to the validity of the mechanized vehicle itself. Not for troop carrying, but as an offensive or a defensive weapon, as you were discussing with me earlier. This whole debate sprung up, especially once one saw the videos and the photographs coming out of the Armenian war, wherein a stockload of Armenian tanks were destroyed by something called loitering drones. You know, this is maybe a one-off situation, or it may be the trend of the future, which something that needs to be looked into. I'd like you to break the situation down and tell us, is it really that easy to kind of do what the Azerbaijanis were able to do, or is it something that is part of the ever evolving phase of warfare?
See, Ari, warfare is all about dominating each other and killing each other and having a better outcome of duels. And it's no different for mechanized forces. When the tank first came up in the Battle of Somme in 1916, in the World War One, it was a major event. But a year later came the anti-tank gun, and then they said that that is the death of a tank. Over a period of time, many anti-tank weapons came up. The attack helicopters came up. Then they said it's the obituary of the tank is there. So I think, as a professional, we need to understand this tank anti-tank duel will continue. And every system, whether it is a tank or a anti-tank, has got certain amount of vulnerabilities and certain amount of capabilities. So you have to address your own vulnerabilities by adapting technologies, tactics, and terrain. And you have to address enemy's vulnerability by your force packaging and by your force application and tactics as such. That's how it is. Now, if you look at the drones that have been hyped up, I would say, in the media particularly, and I've had the good fortune of attending a webinar by someone who had a first-hand experience of drones and in the Syrian conflict as such, and someone who's very well versed with that. See, whether if you talk of Syria, particularly Idlib area where the Turkish used the drones to attack the Syrian Kurds forces and the tank fleet as such, and they integrated with the artillery. They were used by Turkey where tanks were in a constricted urban environment with conscript crews who were operating the tank, no idea of maneuverability, no idea of counter drone tactics. And therefore, it was like drones being used in a shooting range in the field firing ranges. That were his words, that it was there. So you can't carry long lessons, of a particular operation environment and then use that and replicate it on the Indian environment. And that's wrong. Similarly, when you look at the Turkey-backed Azerbaijan forces against the Russian-backed Armenian forces in the long-standing conflict over the Nagorno-Karabakh region, the terrain was mountainous. Again, operation environment was very different. And you read historians and military experts who've written on that. The claims were stunning and grossly inflated more than the number of tanks that existed. You know, I wonder how many times they killed one tank as such. But having said that, Harry, uh, there are lessons in every war. That
Yeah.
yes, drones are a threat. You can't live in a fortress with the roof open. And today, we are increasingly the threat is manifesting through the aerial means where your uh, survivability and protection is least. So you have to keep in mind that. But my underlying factor is to understand each threat and to replicate it. Please understand the 5 T's: terrain specific to an operation environment, the technology assent of both sides, the training of the crews, the tactics adopted and the adaptability, and the threat capability. You know,
Hmm.
when you talk of, we very loosely talk of drones, swarm capabilities. Swarms are micro and mini drones. An anti-tank UCAV or an anti-tank drone to carry the payload has to have a particular size. Its speed gets restricted. It has to be AI assisted, SATCOM aided, and therefore it becomes susceptible to soft and hard kill.
Correct.
So if your ISR system is well in place, if your ground based air defense system is well in place, if your short range air defense system is well in place, and if your tactics of dispersion and maneuver are well in place, I don't think we need to overplay this threat to the extent that, say, the tanks are. Yes, lessons are to be learned, and we need to adapt to this threat. And we are doing it in the Indian context. We've gone for active protection system. We got for VSHORAD systems. We are looking at counter drone capabilities. Our tactics are in place. So, situation is not what it's made out to be. I mean, I often laugh when armchair analysts write on these professional matters without even understanding
Correct.
the front and the back side of a tank as such.
Correct.
So, what should we do? That is the question. Do we ignore it and say, no, this threat is not relevant? Sorry. I feel yes. If not today, if not tomorrow, technology is going to bring in this aerial threat, and we need to look at this aerial threat with all seriousness. And therefore, we need to have an integral multi-layer, multi-tier air defense systems, which is part of the combat force into the ground-based air defense system or the short-range AD systems, along with radar warning integrated force. Uh, uh, Mechanized forces today with the ISR capability and the visibility that are difficult to hide. To say that you will not be detected, I think is a fallacy today. You will be detected. It has a positive that if you're detected, he better fear about it. But he will also send some threat elements too. So we need to understand that we need to enhance our multi-layered and multi-tiered survivability by signature management, by electronic means, by passive, active, and semi-active protection measures. A large number of them are already existing, and some of them are in the pipeline. Third, we must amend, refine, and fine tune our tactics and maneuver to adapt to to defeat such aerial threats. And finally, we also need to evolve counter UCAV and drone technologies, particularly with indigenous character, including offensive drone capability. And above all, I was in fact, I was heading a study on the C5 ISR capability building of the Indian Army, and in my as DG Met Forces, and my major focus was that we must have a foolproof C5 ISR capability for a knowledge-based, decision-oriented network joint force capability for a sensor-to-shooter integration. So if you can't detect a threat today and the threat manifests itself, then you're reacting to the threat.
Correct.
If you detect a threat, then before it manifests, you're able to neutralize. That's it. So therefore, we need to look at our capabilities and refine our tactics, our technologies to cater for the future drone threat. But suffice to say, drones will continue to exist and tanks will continue to flourish, and they will continue to be an instrument of deterrence and peace and an instrument of decision in war. So tanks are there to stay as we look at it.
No, I agree with you, sir, because what happens is in our scenario, especially the media, and one of the reasons I do these interviews is to get the right perspective of a situation. And in our analysis, things are taken to far extreme with a singular incident which actually happens.
You look at the Russians here. You look at the Russians here. 13 drones are fired at their, at their airfields and their naval bases. 7 were destroyed by hard kill, and 6 out of 6, 3 were neutralized by soft kill, and they lost their orientation and went zoomy. 3 they could by soft kill, the electronic measures, they could control them and land them, and they got them there. So no one has spoken on that.
Yeah.
Why? Why have they even spoken that? Because saying that the tanks, obituary is saying, makes big news. Saying the drones are not effective makes small news. But a professional soldier must give the drones a due and amend to adapt to the anti-tank threats as they evolved over a period of time.
Thank you for putting that in perspective, sir. So with regards to Indian technology in terms of building mechanized vehicles of its own, we've been putting our hand into a lot of things. There is a lot of focus on the Arjun MBT. There's a lot of focus on a couple of other things that we are designing as well. Finally, one sees the advent of the private sector into this entire game, which is a very, very, very interesting thing to me, and which shows, I think you speak quite a bit about Atmanirbharta, so it shows a little bit of a spark. I won't be too enthusiastic when I say that, because things do take time. I'd like you to comment on what we have with us, and in terms of what the future plans are and our capabilities of actually going forward with regards mechanized forces with the civil military fusion that we see, especially in this domain.
See, I have observed over the years with great satisfaction of how our private industry and the industrial base is developing. And the policy initiatives that have taken place, we must have some patience. Make in India doesn't happen with a whiff. It will be make for India, made in India, and make in India. It has its transition. But we have a very, very potent, and I'm saying it because I have been actively involved in the integration of efforts of Ordnance Factory Board, the academia, the private industry, the R&D, the DRDO, the user, all integrated to run a project. And I feel that is the way forward, when all become stakeholders and hold hands, because of this even legacy equipment like the T-72 and T-90, where we have licensed production. Today we are at near very close to 100% indigenization of that. How does that happen? Because we were not given the design know-how. We were just given the assembly part of how do we, assemble it. So the design know-how and the logic of it was evolved with the IITs, with all the MTech young students, evolved with the private industry, and we came back and we made certain parts and assemblies and technologies which is superior to what even the Russians gave us. You know, so that is the potential and excitement in the Indian. Now, what is the scope? Uh, I would say mechanized forces are going to be the harbinger of technology and are giving a boost to the defense industry. Why I say so? The one, numbers make good business sense. We are a large, so let's be very clear that defense industry is also a business.
Yeah.
There is patriotism, there is nationalism, but no one wants to run at a loss. He has to pay, he has to buy. He also has a business run.
Yeah.
So numbers make good business. Second, mechanized forces have a concept of lifetime maintenance and the lifetime management. So right from boom to tomb, you would be looking after it, evolving it, maintaining it, upgrading it. And so there is a continuity of a business also. And upgradation takes place, so it makes very good sense. Third, it entails all technologies. It entails, armament technology, it takes automotive technology, it entails survivability technology, it entails electronics technology, digitization. It entails all technologies. And the biggest challenge is not these technologies. Biggest challenge is integration of these technologies into one platform in such a manner that holistically that platform performs exceedingly well.
Sure.
Therefore, I had thought about in my tenure something known as a long-term fleet management perspective, which went up to beyond 2052 as such, because you have to, when you look at a mechanized forces, a tank has a lifetime of 32 to 32 years or so, and then you have to have a life extension of another 10 to 15 years. So unless you have a 40, 50 years perspective of long-term fleet management, which entails how do you upgrade a present equipment to get it to the next level of state of art or contemporary? The present contemporary equipment upgraded to become the front line. And while all this is happening, how do you induct the next generation equipment? So there has to be, I would say, an approach which one looks at value and vulnerability and risk analysis. What value you want to give, what vulnerability exists in you that you want to exist, and what risks in terms of temporal time frame are you wanting to take. Two, the technology. This large fleet cannot have, entire fleet cannot be technologically upgraded. If you today start upgrading X factor in a tank, it takes 7 to 8 years for the entire fleet to be the earliest, because it's such a large fleet. So therefore, there has to be a spiral approach and a prioritized approach to technology induction. In situ technologies, please use it immediately to that. Next generation technology, do an R&D simultaneously with your IITs, by your private industry. Invest more and more into your R&D, both in terms of technology, in terms of manufacturing technology, in terms of quality control technologies, and so that next every 5 to 7 years you have a technology which is proven and coming. And then you give the IITs the next generation technologies, or let's say those path breaking technologies, which they can study as a futuristic thing and pass it on then to the R&D labs and this thing, and then the R&D labs make that. So it has to have a continuity factor and a spiral approach factor, and mechanized forces have to look at that. And I think all that is well in place and documented, but it needs to be implemented. The key issue is we need, we understand that there is a resource limitation which will continue to be there, but within that resource, limitation, and it has to go over the entire spectrum of war fighting, well understood. But we need to have a prioritized approach, and like I say, please address and understand what is your value that you need to give, what is the vulnerability that you need to address, and what are the risks that you're willing to undertake.
Fair enough. That's very interesting. So, but with the current focus, as you yourself said, that we weren't given the know-how in terms of how to build up these tanks. We were given the drawings and stuff like that. So that means there is what a layman can derive out of it, that there is a certain amount of know-how which already exists in this country with regards making these kind of vehicles. Do you, in the near future, with the threats that we see around us and multiplying day by day from all sides of our nation, do you see us actually coming out with a 100% indigenous, tank or a mechanized vehicle which can be put into action fast enough for our troops to kind of get used to and actually move forward with?
Very frankly, I would say, like you mentioned, that we have the know-how, but the know-why was not existing, and therefore we could not design or upgrade equipment because of, we were going in for ex-import equipment and license production, which has its own limitations. But we have come a long way. Yet, my perspective is that we are still in a stage of transition and stabilization as far as complex weapon platforms are concerned. We have made success in artillery system, but they are less complex than a tank system as such. We made progress in aircrafts, which is a very good thing. Submarines, again, very complex system. So it's only a matter of time. And as I look at it presently, while I have my own reservations on the operational efficacy in the larger perspective of Arjun's as such, and I openly have said that, but they are positive to that. They are technologies which we have fine-tuned, whether indigenous or indigenized, which can be utilized. So we have a certain base, we have a certain learning which is there, and we have an evolving defense industry. So let me put it that in the next 15 years, as such, my perspective is, will be a period of, as far as complex combat frontline vehicles are concerned, with total indigenous capability and IPR levers with us. It will take a little time as such. But in the interim period is a period where we can integrate with players who are mature in these technologies, get to learn, get to know why of those technologies, build up on that, further our base. So it's going to be like made for India, like I said earlier, make in India, and then made in India. That joy is going to come, but it's going to take place. But war is not going to, when you go to battle, you don't say that, okay, I'm going to fight with the equipment which made in India, so it's going to, you fight with the equipment which is best going to deliver and going to have a weapon effectiveness index greater than the enemy. As a soldier, I'm being very frank about it, and therefore, this transition period we will have to manage by joint ventures, collaborations with players, and at the same time, not losing focus on how do we build the ultimate goal of having an indigenous equipment to fight your own wars. That is an imperative and important for strategic autonomy. Otherwise, every time there's a critical situation, you go for an emergency procurement. Let me tell you, when you go for an emergency procurement, wherever you're going for, they exploit you because they know you're on unassay. So we must learn our lessons and move ahead for indigenous capability, for which it is very important. We by tradition, not only in defense forces, but everywhere, every facet as a nation, we live in cocoons and compartmentalized zones. You name it. I think if you're looking at a defense capability, you have to break this up. The user, the developer, the technologist, the academia, the manufacturer, all have to be together, speak the same language, sit together, help each other to understand, and then evolve together with joint responsibility. Accountability, responsibility must be there when people speak to each other. Then you'll get a platform which is worthy of being called a holistic platform with state-of-art technologies.
Some very wise advice. I hope somebody
And
listens to
also,
it.
I would just add, uh, we have to be pragmatic. We have to balance expansion, modernization, uh, sustenance, and operational readiness. These are conflicting. If your resources are limited to achieve the desired end, so the decision makers have to have a very fine balance between what you have to to modernize it to the level that you require its weapon effectiveness index. To make sure that it is modernized to that effect, you have to sustain it and have adequate reserves in all facets, whether it is ammunition, whether it is others, and then simultaneously look at how much can you expand. You know, it can't be that you keep diluting your modernization and sustainability budget for expansion. It doesn't isn't done. What you have must be very very potent, and your modernization priorities must be well structured. Technology inspired approach must be well structured.
Interesting. I think that leaves a lot of food for thought with regards to what India needs to do in terms of building up its. And you mentioned this about tanks. I think this particular platform that you mentioned pretty much fits on all sorts of weapon systems. It's not just on the mechanized forces. It would fit well
It should be because it's important to understand. When we talk indigenous capability, we must look at a family of platforms.
Yeah.
If I've got a tank, I should be able to use that base of that tank for various variants for the air defense track vehicle, artillery system, anti-tank system. You look at the logistics maintainability factor of all this. It helps so much. So you have to have your vision and a long-term vision and a clear understanding that when you say make in India, how will you facilitate that? You can't have 15 different types of platforms and chassis. You look at the logistic model that you create. You know, so you have to have a holistic view of the entire thing if you're looking at an indigenous capability. And I'm sure not only will you have your indigenous capability, another 30 years you'll be exporting capabilities.
I hope I get to see that day. It'll be one happy day in my life, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, my last question to you: and mechanized forces from the lumbering tanks, which could probably be overtaken by a man walking a little faster in the First World War, to these blitzkrieg German machines that shocked the world in the Second World War. From then to today, the capability of that particular tank is increased and increased and increased. The designs are pretty much, after the First World War and the Second World War, there was a huge design change that actually happened. But from the Second World War till date, of course, to a trained eye, you can see the design change. To a layman, you still see the same structure with this big, huge turret gun on the top, which can, shoot in all directions. I want to ask you this, sir. With regards mechanized forces as a whole, we've come up to personnel carriers and, a whole lot of things, armored vehicles and a whole lot of things, sir. Where do you see this entire push going forward into the future? Are we going to see a new design of a tank? Are we going to see a whole new type of vehicle which is going to come out? Where do you see it going?
Okay, Hari, you know, you have to manage change before change manages you. you know, so that goes for all professional soldiers and professional organizations. No, World War II, we spoke of, in fact, World War One onwards, we spoke of the famous iron triangle of firepower, mobility, and protection as the three pillars of a tank design or an armored fighting vehicle design. And then that iron triangle got so deeply embedded as a cast in our mind that we stopped questioning it with period of time. And I've been questioning it myself. Look, your firepower today has to be replaced by lethality. It is effect. So your firepower is not the quantum and what, it's the lethality that you're able to impact on it. Mm. Your mobility has to be in terms of your agility. So it's lethality, agility, and it's not protection, it's survivability. Protection is just one small facet of survivability. It's like adding armor. And that also think that more the armor, the better the protection, and the heavier it is, the mightier it is. Sorry, that is gone. That is gone. You're not looking at Matilda and those Tiger tanks and heavy tanks of World War One and World War Two. Today you're looking at agility, survivability, lethality, and two more factors. Looking at connectivity, networking, situational awareness of that platform, because of that, it's a whole. And you're looking at adaptability, because today, again, I have been saying it in all forums, whether in uniform or others, we need to understand the mechanized force canvas in its true perspective. It is not just armor and, like I mentioned earlier, it's not armor and mechanized infantry and ranks or ICVs. It is a much larger canvas that we need to understand. We need to integrate. And I feel today your attack helicopters have to be part of your mechanized forces as such, because they're an extension of your ground maneuver. They complement the ground maneuver, and the ground maneuver complements them. So if you're looking at operational maneuvers and futuristic maneuvers, then you have to look at these capabilities holistically. So therefore, there has to be a change in mindset when you look at the design criteria and the design aspect of that. It will still be called, you might call it a tank, you might call it a mobile protective lethal platform, MPVs, people have been calling it. You call it anything. But the essence of it is the capability that it should generate, both as an individual platform and as a part of the holistic force packaging. Having said that, what would I like to see, keeping in mind the threats and capabilities in the future as mechanized forces? Uh, I think the first thing that I would like to see, and I've been saying this again and again, that we need to look at our force structure and organizations, revisit them to make them lean and lethal. There should be greater assent on integration of force equipment, training, application, commonality of platforms, and instead of having pure tank, pure mech, pure admit, like we speak of integrated battle groups. In fact, that is one thing that, as additional director general perspective planning, I had made that proposal way back and floated a paper. But we have to have cohesive, integrated organization both at grassroots level. That means bottom to up and top to bottom. You can't have a directorate for tank, you can't have a directorate for mechanized infantry, you can't have a directorate for attack helicopters, you can't. I mean, unless you sit together, think together, train together, have your complementary equipping thing together at the desk level, at the colonel or the lieutenant colonel who's the start point of presentation at Army headquarters, or the person who at a cutting edge who's going to implement. You don't do your combat grouping at a particular war scenario. I mean, you have to have an intrinsic thing, yet have flexibility to add and minus things. So I feel organization restructuring to make it lean and lethal is important. Second is, I think, like I mentioned, change in mindsets of the modeling concept of tanks, which I spoke of, lethality and agility and survivability, connectivity, digitization, networking, electronics, sustainability, and adaptability to its various forms. I also I told you that we must have a commonality of platform. And lastly, when we look at mechanized forces, we must look at mechanized forces in the context of operational and strategic maneuver, because these strategic and operational maneuvers are meant to dislocate enemy forces physically, psychologically, morally, temporarily in terms of time frame and technology. Thus, we must look at them as a whole force package.
I must say, so that you would have thought about this particular thing quite a bit when you wrote that paper. So it is quite important for one to understand something like this, because one thing that I really feel is that sometimes when the debate about these things are done especially in public fora, people live in the past. And in 1971 we did this, and that fair enough. We need to look at the warfare of the future. Warfare is
history is a place of reference, not residence.
Correct, absolutely. I think you brought it out better than I was trying to do so. So this has been a brilliant talk, and to be honest, I did do some reading before I spoke to you, but it's kind of given me a whole new perspective of this entire thing. And I'm sure it will do so for every viewer that actually sees this video. You've taken us through your views of the Chinese standoff, the requirement of the light tank, which today is much in debate. And I think there is some movement also which is being seen. The myth busting that you did about the vulnerability of the so-called drone attacks on tanks and stuff like that. Every situation has its own vulnerability. They've been various the best of the best systems that have failed at the best of the best times. So that's part of the game, I guess, and that's something that you brought out very, very well. Post which, what India should do, its own Make in India initiatives, make for India, make with India, and make in India. Very interesting. I think that brings about a very clear perspective of how we should step by step move forward. And finally, your vision for the future of mechanized forces. So once again, eye-opening discussion. Thank you for taking this time out. And of course, yes, I'd love to actually have a further conversation with you about this and any other topic that comes about in discussions of the defense of our great nation some other time. Till then, sir, Jai Hind.
Jai Hind, and thank you so much for putting across the questions and very relevant issues. Thank you, Adi. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. Jai Hind.